Workshop topics: installing the Myford ML7R lathe on one of the side workbenches. Now I have the Smart & Brown lathe back on its cabinet stand and the Boxford lathe on its cabinet stand, I really didn't have the space to put this on a cabinet stand. This is the original chip tray that I bought with the Myford. It was green, but now, thanks to a company down the road called Powder & Paint, it's beautifully powder coated in Myford grey. Powder & Paint are one of the best powder coating companies I've ever used. Here's the web address on screen. I'm going to securely bolt the lathe to this chip tray. But first, once upon a time in 1999, I rebuilt this Land Rover. It's a 1971 Series 2A. I rebuilt it using a coil-sprung galvanised chassis, a glass fibre bonnet and various other modifications, stainless steel caliper pistons, etc, etc. Even the main bulkhead, which is a great source of rust on Land Rovers, was hot zinc metal sprayed and filled with wax oil, plus it was a new bulkhead too. I really enjoyed this rebuild. All of it was done outside. There's some more details about it via my website. The article and the photographs are in the Keith's Pages section. You must forgive me for rambling on about Land Rovers. What is it to do with installing a Myford on my bench? Well, quite a lot really. The door fixings are what I used to install the Myford on the bench, and here they are. In the Land Rover application, these captive nuts clipped into the main doorpost of the bulkhead. But for fixing the Myford lathe securely to the chip tray, I can't use the cages, so I just ground them off and removed the nuts. I also drilled some washers, but in the end I didn't use these, I just used the nuts underneath. Because I'm going to mount this Myford on a kitchen worktop on top of a cabinet, I was worried about the noise. And for that reason I decided to use 3 of these. These are kneeling pads. Now you have a choice here. You can buy these kneeling pads at £15 each, or you can buy special sound absorbent foam for putting loudspeakers on. In my recording studio, each of my monitor speakers are also mounted on these kneeling pads. You can of course buy the proper sound absorbent foam if you wish to pay 4 times the price, for something that will do the job just as well as these kneeling pads will. Just to recap, I'm going to use 4 Land Rover door mounting bolts, 3 extra thick kneeling pads, and the beautifully powder-coated chip tray. This hopefully will mount the Myford and keep it quiet. I don't wish to antagonise my very strange neighbour. There is one minor problem though. I am 68 years old. The Myford is currently sat on the worktop on the side bench, and because I is well old in it, I am not as strong as I used to be. The Myford was originally put on the worktop by myself and my good friend Rob Metcalf. And even then, for such a small machine, it really did feel very heavy as we moved it from the table onto the worktop. This time I'm doing it all by myself, so I'm going to have to apply some science. I have a couple of small pieces of English oak that were offcuts from an engine mounting. What I'm doing here, using one hand, is lifting the tailstock end of the Myford up into the air so that I can place one of these oak blocks under the headstock end of the Myford. When the Myford is lifted, it has a tendency to want to fall backwards because of the weight of the motor. You really have to take care of this. To prevent damage to the top of the Myford, I used a substantial piece of plywood against the wall. The rest of this sequence is fairly self-explanatory. It's not my original idea. Many years ago, my father, who was a lorry driver, told me how when he delivered a printing press to a company, all the workers went for lunch, leaving him stood in the yard. But when they got back from the lunch, they were surprised to find my father had gone and the printing press was sat on 2 stout pieces of timber on the ground. Luckily, in the local vicinity of the delivery were lots of pieces of wood. He built a small tower to the level of the articulated lorry's trailer and used this very crowbar that I'm using to bar the printing press down onto the tower. Then he just knocked out alternate pieces of wood until it sat on just 2 on the ground. I remember being very impressed by this story when I was younger. And now, many years later, my father's long gone, but I'm applying the same kind of technology. But I'm only lifting the lathe one end at a time in this case. Here, once again, I'm lifting the lathe with one hand at the tailstock end so I can slide the chip tray into position, but the wood's in the way. And in this clip, I'm carefully tapping the piece of wood out of the way. And please be aware that I'm putting no pressure whatsoever on the opening door. The load is being taken at the moment by the plate that holds the door securely to the lathe bed. I've increased the video speed to shorten the sequence. Time now once again to lift it at the tailstock end and slide the chip tray underneath, but no, there's still one piece of wood in the way. More slight ultraviolence is required. I just hammer the piece of wood out of the way, being very careful not to hammer it too hard and dislodge what's holding the lathe up. It just needs to clear the big piece of plywood board. When I try the chip tray in position again, I realise that the main flat piece of plywood also needs to be moved out of the way. But not very far this time, so I'll pull the chip tray out and tap the piece of plywood just a very small amount. Time for a health and safety warning. This job could be very dangerous if you don't do it properly. I do not recommend doing it anyway. I was just curious to see whether I could do it on my own. Move the lathe, that is. This is the other piece of oak supporting the tailstock end of the bed. Obviously I did remove the tailstock to lighten it. But as you can see here, I didn't remove the tailstock originally. I didn't even notice it was there. I wondered why it felt so heavy at this end. Now I have to lift the tailstock end one more time, minus the tailstock. I'm going to lift the lathe with my right hand, and with my left hand I'm going to manoeuvre the chip tray into place underneath the bed and on top of the piece of oak. And now it looks like this. The final part of this lifting job is to remove the packing and drop the lathe down onto the chip tray very carefully. The first piece of wood to remove is the other piece of oak, which I now fit underneath the chip tray as shown here. I gently and carefully lifted the lathe using my crowbar and slid the piece of oak underneath the chip tray. Now it's time to bolt it all together. A little bit of minor adjustment is needed and the bolt falls into position. This may look dangerous, but it's not. The lathe is sat on two pieces of oak and various bits of wood at the headstock end, and also, just in case everything else fails, one of the kneeling pads is also underneath. There is no possible way I would risk putting my fingers underneath this lathe unless it was properly supported. This clip looks a bit wrong. What is supporting the tailstock end of the lathe? Nothing. All the weight's at the left-hand side, and as I remove the bottom plywood packing, the weight of the lathe at the headstock end, complete with the saddle, lifts the other end, which is much lighter. Finally, I gently use my crowbar to lift the weight of the lathe off first one piece of oak and then the other. With the lathe fully bolted to the chip tray, all I need to do now is gently use the crowbar to lift the lathe very slightly so I can position all three of the kneeling pads. Now it's time for a test to make sure that the lathe does actually run quietly on this worktop, which in turn is on top of a kitchen cabinet. And as you can hear, the lathe is running very quietly indeed. There are two jobs still left to do. One of them, of course, is to fit the chip guard to prevent anything flying off the chuck and going through the window. And to accommodate the chip guard, I had to cut one of the kneeling pads. I think it's time to fit a tool into the tool post and see if everything works okay. The tool that I'm fitting into the tool post is a new tool, but it's a horrible one. I don't like these at all. They come as a cheap set and they do the job, I just don't get on with them at all. After checking the tool height with the centre in the chuck, I lock the position of the holder with the Allen bolt at the top. Now, without the aid of a safety net, it's time to see if it works, and yes, it works fine. The tool isn't terribly good, but it's cutting this brass really well. I'll try a heavier cut and see what happens. Yes, this is very encouraging. Don't forget, a Myford ML7R is a very small lathe. The finish on the brass isn't particularly spectacular, but this after all is a roughing tool. I placed two orders recently, one with RDG Tools and one with Myford Limited for an oil gun, because the one that I bought off eBay was just, well, very cheap and very poor. That's it for this one. The Myford is installed. Stay healthy, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. and by doing that you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists you can actually watch the videos back to back.